hope y'all don't mind. I'm not trying to rush going through Romans. Hope y'all don't mind. It's one of the most influential books. Are you laughing because you think I am rushing? But I mean, this is only one of the most influential books in Western civilization. So it's it's a little light reading that most of us don't understand very well. We especially don't put it in its proper context in the arguments and the discussions that they were having at the time. Of course, remember, Paul didn't write this to be a great theological work. He wrote it to a synagogue, to a congregation in need, that were struggling, trying to come to terms with what is this new faith. So it was a pastoral letter. And last week, I shared how Paul, to a large extent, he's arguing against the position of what's known as the school of Shammai in regard to the Gentiles and their place or position in salvation. What's their relationship to the Torah? Should the Gentiles should be doing and keeping the Torah? That's more a reflection of the other school of thought, the other dominant position of the day from Hillel, which Paul comes from that background. So because he believed the Gentiles had a place in the world to come, he also thought it was important that they know the Torah, or that they have access or be available to it. And that should seem obvious to us, given what we come to and we read all the time out of Isaiah chapter 2. Y'all remember this passage, right? This is the end days. This is leading into and up into the kingdom, that it will come to pass in the last days, that the mountain of Adonai's house will stand firm as head of the mountains and will be exalted above the hills. That's language that Daniel uses about the tower or the statue being broken and the mountains being leveled before his kingdom, his stone that will be raised up above all the others. So it will be exalted above the hills, so all nations will flow to it, to Adonai's house, to the temple. All nations, all Gentiles are supposed to be going there. Then many peoples will go and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of Adonai, to the house of God, to the God of Jacob. Then he will teach us his ways, and we will walk in his paths." Where do they learn that? Where do these nations that are in that future going up to the mountain, to the house of Adonai, they learn that from the Torah? For Torah will go forth from Zion, and the word of Adonai from Jerusalem. In those last days and afterward, they'll be flowing to Jerusalem to be taught his ways, to walk in his path. That means, that's talking about the Torah-based lifestyle of his chosen people. The Torah-based lifestyle for his people is meant to be shared. Right? Y'all see that? It's meant to be shared with the nations. They'll take those nations that come to Jerusalem, to the temple, they'll take what they learn in Jerusalem. They'll take that way of life and walking in his ways and his paths. They'll take what they learn here, take the Torah back with them into their homes out there among the nations to teach those who didn't make the trip with them. And as we often say, since if we know that this is the future, we say this often, or if you don't hear it enough, if we know that this is the future, this is where we're supposed to be going, that this is the destination, that the Gentiles will be learning and keeping Torah, Paul seems to be encouraging the Jews in Rome to get busy moving and leading toward that goal. He's trying to get the Jews in Rome to lead the Gentiles here. If we know that this is the destination, you should be starting to take some steps to get to that destination. Right? Y'all have heard me say that before? And that's actually following, we looked at this last week, following Yeshua's instructions in the Great Commission. Where he talks about having all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me, and he tells them to go, those who are hearing him, his disciples, his Jewish disciples, to go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, immersing those nations in the name of the Father and the Son and the Ruach HaKodesh, in the name of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, teaching them, and we went over this real brief. I'll go over this briefly. Did he say, teach them to observe some that I've commanded you, or most that I've commanded you? Or was it all? Teaching those nations, teaching those Gentiles to observe all that I have commanded you disciples who are right here in front of me, you Jewish people who are right here in front of me, my covenant people, you are to teach them all that I have commanded you. And remember, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Messiah Yeshua is with his disciples when they are living for this mission, when they are bringing the nations to his Torah, to his way of life. They are hearing and obeying his voice, the voice of their shepherd, when they not just hear what he has to say, but do what he has to say. And anywhere that they go with this effort, he will empower them, he will make them successful. Yeshua wants some, most, or all of his disciples to live by his commands. What do you think? Is it some? Is it most? Is it all? He wants all his disciples to live by his commandments. If you love me, we read this earlier, you will obey my commands. He wants you to live by the laws of the king, because he is the king. If you remember, we've talked about definitions of legalism before around here. The most common one that we hear, that we talk about, that our culture understands, is the one of legalism is trying to earn your salvation or your place in that world to come by keeping the Torah, right? That's what we hear most often, right? We get that one all the time. How many of y'all are sick of hearing that accusation and that charge? Yeah, there's a lot of hands, right? That's how the world understands legalism, and anything about keeping Torah is automatically put in that little box. So it should go without saying that any believer in Messiah should live by his commands, right? We should all live by his commands, because we are pledging our loyalty to our service of the King. We're just disagreeing on what that law actually is. Right? Most people, when they talk about that, we obviously should understand we are not saved. We do not earn our place in the world to come. We are not justified by keeping Torah. That should be obvious. And when you hear and talk to most people who make that kind of accusation, most people say they don't want to be under the law. They don't want to live by the Torah as spelled out in the Tanakh, in the Old Testament, like those Jewish people do and used to do. They don't want to be under that kind of system. But this is not the only definition of legalism, really, that the Scripture points out. The Scripture points out that legalism really is having or living by any law, rule, or code of conduct, any set of commandments other than the king's law. Right? If a king controls a territory, this is his land, this is his nation. To live by another law is to have another king. You hear me? If you don't want to accept the king's law, then you're not willing to live under his authority. So legalism is really having or living by any law, rule, or code of conduct other than the king's. And that's why it's easy to say, why we should say, any believer in Messiah should live by his command, because his law is the king. And if you don't want to live under the Torah, if you don't want to live under the law of the king as spelled out in the Tanakh, like those Jewish people do, without realizing it, what you're saying is that Yeshua's law, if you say, I just want to obey Yeshua, okay. If you're saying that's different, you're saying that Yeshua's law, that his standard, his code of conduct, his Torah is different from the Father's. And you don't want to go there. What's one of the names of the Antichrist? He is known as the man of lawlessness. He is known as the man of Torah-lessness. He is called that because the Antichrist rejects the law of the rightful king because he wants to establish his own authority. He wants to establish his own rule. That's why he is called the man of lawlessness. But I believe that God's standards, his Torah in the Tanakh, all those things are descriptions of holiness and righteousness. All those commandments and instructions on worship. All those things that we seem and we may have grown up with thinking how tedious they are. Those are actually a reflection of the character and nature of Adonai. It's the character and nature of the Father. Right? His covenant people are supposed to be holy. They're supposed to be kedoshim. For what reason? Why are we, as his people, supposed to be holy? Because he is. The holiness that he is calling us to is a reflection of his. So all of his instructions about this is what holiness is, this is what righteousness is, that's a reflection of who he is. His command, he commands our conduct as a reflection of his conduct, of his being, of his nature. And is his nature arbitrary and changing, or is it eternal and unchanging? He is the Lord. He does not change. So for Yeshua to come along and have a separate or a new standard that is different from the Father's Torah of the Old Testament is saying that Yeshua does not have the same nature or the same being or the same character as the Father. Now, most people don't realize that's what they're saying. But that's what they're saying. I highly doubt traditional Christianity realizes that, or they're willing to say that when it's put that way. Because if you're saying that Yeshua has a different or a new command that is different from what has been revealed already, you're making him more like the anti-Messiah than you are making him like the Messiah, especially in the eyes of the Jewish people. But again, we go back to King Messiah wants all his disciples, all the citizens of his kingdom, to keep his commandments and what he has to say, his commandments. He does not say anything that contradicts the words and commands of the Father. And he repeats that multiple times. John chapter 12 was one example. He says, "For I did not speak on my own, but the Father himself who sent me has commanded me what to say and speak. And I know that his commandment is life everlasting. Therefore, what I say just as the Father has told me." So is Yeshua going to say something different or contrary or other than what has been revealed? No, he's not. He's not giving a new or different Torah. Again, rather he wants all who have faith in Messiah to keep the Torah. We looked at last week the Gentiles keeping Torah, that they shouldn't be resented for it by those who have been the gatekeepers of the Torah for so long. Salvation and the Torah is to the Jew first and then to the Gentile. And it's not just the hearers of the Torah, but the doers of the Torah who will be justified before God. So it's a good thing. It should be seen and understood as a good thing when the Gentiles come along and show that the Torah is written on their heart. Everybody should celebrate that. And in no way does that diminish the unique status, the unique calling of the Jewish people as God's people, because that's something irrevocable. He says that later. But with that special calling comes a great responsibility and accountability. Paul, he's been talking about this all along, but he points that out in verse 17. Romans chapter 2, verse 17. He says, if you call yourself Jewish, and you rely upon the Torah, and you boast in God, right? So compared to the Gentiles and the terrible idolatry of the nations, the Jewish people do have a lot to boast about. And he's saying, if you call yourself Jewish and you stake your claim as we are closer to God than you. We are closer to God, to Adonai, morally. We are superior because we have the Torah. Because you have the Torah, and because you have it, you know His will, and you are able to determine what matters. Because you are instructed from the Torah, you determine what matters to who? You determine what matters to just anybody, to yourself? Is that what really matters? No, it's what matters to Him. Because you have the Torah, God's will is not an abstract construct. It's not a concept. It's not an unknown. He has revealed what He wants from His people in His Word. So the Jewish people, the Israel, the nation, can determine what matters, to know not just what is good, but what is best. You can determine and understand, discern the times. You can interpret the signs. You know the terms of the covenants of promise and what God expects of you. And that makes the role that He has given this great people that are able to boast in God, it makes that all the more important, because verse 19 goes along and says, because of all of that, you are sure that you are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, a corrector of the foolish, a teacher of the immature, having in the Torah the embodiment of knowledge and the truth. So is that a pretty clear job description? And I hope I always forget to check this because it always seems to remove some of my advances. Okay. They have a job description in those two verses. They are to be a guide. They are to be the light. They are to be the correctors. They are to be the teachers because they possess the truth. And who are they supposed to do all that guiding to and shining light to and correcting and teaching? Who are they supposed to do that for? The people who don't have any of that, right? The people who don't possess the truth. But somewhere along the way, the job description and these verses or these ideas like this got distorted. Somewhere along the way, men like Shammai focused less on what this responsibility as a Jewish person is, what they have according to those concepts, those ideas. And instead of focusing on the job description, they're focusing more on the value of those who don't have the Torah. Right? He's looking at the value description of the people they're supposed to be going to. Because those people are blind. Those people are in darkness. Those people are foolish and ignorant and immature. Those people don't have the truth. If you focus on that, you're not going to do your job. None of that's wrong, by the way. Right? In talking about the nations without the Torah, none of that's wrong. But it's not making a value statement about them as human beings. If the nations are in the condition, let me back up. If the nations are in this condition, because they do not have the Torah, and they are in that condition, then the only ones able to help and improve their situation are who? The Jewish people, because they have the Torah. Following? You with me on that? Because all of those things about what Messiah does for us is right there as well. Because when you think about that job description, yeah, okay, is he our guide? Is he the light? Is he our corrector? Is he our teacher? Is he the one who possesses the truth? Is that Messiah? Yes. And what does he do to those who are blind? Doesn't he heal the blind? What does he do for those that are held captive in darkness? Does he not free them? Does he not give instruction to the foolish and the ignorant? Does he not help grow up those who are immature? As the truth, does he not reveal and fully preach the truth? Isn't that Matthew 5 all over again? Do not think that I have come to abolish the Torah or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to do what? To fulfill them, to bring them to their fullness, to fully preach them. See, if the Jewish believers of that first century era, if they adopt or hold on to that mentality of Shammai, they will not fulfill their calling. Nor will they walk as Yeshua walked. This was a struggle even for those who believed in Yeshua. Because this statement is less a description of the Jewish people and more about the Torah itself and what they're supposed to be doing with it. Because the Jewish people can't guide anybody who's blind. They can't be the light to anybody in darkness. They can't correct or teach the ignorant or the immature based upon their own knowledge or based upon their own righteousness, right? It's only because the only way that they have that job description at all is because Adonai gave them the Torah, and they received it, and they accepted it. And on top of that, even in their superior position, they still have to be careful. They still have to judge their own behavior. They have been given the Torah, and they think of themselves as the ones who are the guide, the light, the corrector, the teacher, because they possess the truth. But then he challenges them, watch yourself. You then who teach another, you Jewish believers who have the Torah, who teach another, those that are in the darkness, the Gentiles, do you not teach yourself? You who preach not to steal, do you steal? If you're seeking to fulfill your calling, even if you are teaching the Torah to the Gentiles, make sure you hear your own lesson. Before you try to hold the Gentiles to God's standards, make sure you're keeping his standards yourself. Don't be a hearer only, but also a doer. Don't steal. Okay. Well, do you? There's more than one way to steal in the scriptures. Y'all realize that, right? There's more than one way to steal. It's more than just taking something that's not yours that's considered stealing. The Torah lifts up things like dishonest scales as a form of theft, of unequal weights and measures as a type of theft. Even hiring somebody and not paying them at the end of the day, that's a form of theft. You can steal when you give to Caesar what is Caesar's, but not giving God what is God's. And Caesar can be a lot of things in this world, can't he? Caesar is not just a figurehead. We have a lot of Caesars, things that rule in our life. And of course, there's that question of, do you rob God? That's how Malachi puts it. Will a man steal from or rob God? For you are robbing me. But you say, well, how have we robbed you? They're asking the same kind of question in the tithe and the offering. You've been cursed with the curse, yet you keep robbing me, the whole nation. It says, bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, then there will be food in my house. Now test me in this, says Adonai Tzavaot, if I will not open for you the windows of heaven and pour out blessing for you until no one is without enough. So we can steal in more ways than one. Then Paul mentions, idolatry or adultery. He says, you who say not to commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who detest idols, do you rob temples? Again, we oftentimes place adultery as one type of act, but Scripture doesn't. Yeshua talked about the eyes, right? He talked about what's going on in the thoughts, in the heart. Looking and thinking about, coveting another person is adultery of the heart. Scripture equates idolatry to adultery. There's a reason why those two statements are put together. Sure, it's easy to condemn the pagans, but do we have sacred cows of our own? Just a few, maybe? In coming this direction, most of us have had to battle a sacred cow of some type or another that's been touched on and that you've been challenged on, whether it be a certain type of food or a certain holiday in December or a family opinion. I mean, have we had some sacred cows stepped on? You detest idols, you complain about them, you condemn them, but do you take things off their altar? Do you, and this is always a bit of a fight, do you knowingly benefit from or enjoy something that you claim to hate? There's this one's tough for our culture. We see enough about the famous clergy scandals that are out there. Those who condemn drugs and alcohol get caught with drugs and alcohol, right? Doing the very thing privately that gets condemned publicly. We disparage and rag on Hollywood, Netflix, Disney, HBO, ESPN, gambling, the lottery, all those kind of things, but we still pay our monthly subscription to those things. Right? That hurts a little bit. Paul then, he speaks to those who uphold and exalt the Torah. He's talking about them in the sense of, if you're going to lift it up, you better be doing what it says. He's repeating that again. Verse 23, he says, you who take pride in the Torah, through your violation of the Torah, do you dishonor God? Or as it is written, the name of God is slandered among the nations because of you. For the Jewish people, their history in Israel, having the Torah is wonderful. It is great. It is very significant and necessary. But you think about even among the Jewish people, but the world out there at the time, 99% of the time, unless you were significantly wealthy, the only place you had to be able to access the Torah or the scrolls is in the synagogue with the Jewish people. Because they were the only ones that could have it and afford to have it. That's why Acts 15 is so important, emphasizing being in the synagogue every Shabbat and hearing Moses. But having it in a beautiful ark, processing it through the fellowship, does not excuse or minimize or hide the fact that we still break it. Even as we're trying to honor it, as we're trying to exalt and lift up the Torah as the authority in our life, we still violate it in many ways. When we are hearers and not doers, when we fail to live up to our mission and our calling, when we are doing privately what we say we are against publicly, we are dishonoring God in the eyes of those that we are actually trying to reach. How many of y'all get annoyed when you see somebody not just, driving 90 miles an hour in a school zone, which is bad enough, right? But you see a little Christian fish on the back of the car. Y'all find that annoying? I find that really annoying. It's bad enough that they're doing 90 in a school zone, But then you see that on there, and he's like, man, what are you doing? What kind of witness are you giving here? And I'd better not see a restoration sticker on somebody's car, by the way, doing 90 in a school zone. But this verse is quoting from Isaiah chapter 52. It's quoted out of the Septuagint when the northern kingdom is taken off into captivity by Assyria. But even then, that sense of dishonor didn't stop, because even as they were taken away, they were still not keeping the Torah. But even this has a purpose, because even for the northern kingdom, repentance, redemption, restoration is the goal. It's through this discipline from God that the good news, that the gospel of the kingdom is sown. So he's quoting from Isaiah 52:5, but y'all might recognize these verses that immediately follow. Verse 6, therefore my people will know my name. Therefore in that day I am the one who will be saying, Hineni, here I am. Then he goes into how beautiful on the mountains are the feet of him who brings the good news, brings the gospel, who announces shalom, who brings good news of happiness, who announces salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns. Do y'all recognize that passage? Right, that's right after he says the name of God is slandered among the nations. And it's also just like Ezekiel 36. In the verses right before, we often read about the new heart, about the ruach and the heart of flesh. Right before that passage, that there's this failure to be the guide to the blind, the light, the corrector, the teacher, because of their own breaking of the Torah, and that causes God's name to be blasphemed. But redemption is always the goal, because it's his reputation that's on the line. He says, I scattered them among the nations, so they were dispersed through the countries, out there among those Gentiles. According to their way and their deeds I judged them. And wherever they went among the nations, they profaned my holy name, since it was said about them, these are the people of Adonai, yet they had to leave his land. How strong, how great could he actually be if they're having to be scattered out among the nations? That's the question the nations would ask. But he says, I had concern for my holy name, which the house of Israel had profaned among the nations wherever they went. This is one reason why we are given the Ruach, so that we will walk in his laws and keep his rulings and do them, so that we won't be just hearers of the Torah, but doers, and that's the doers that will be justified. This is the reason why all his people have received his spirit, because they went off into exile because they were not keeping the Torah correctly. Typically when we talk about keeping the Torah, the Sabbath, the feasts, and people accuse us of legalism, we're trying to earn our salvation, oftentimes what do we say in return, in comeback? Don't we say things like, well, I don't do this so I can get saved, but because I am saved, right? And we talk about the blessing for obedience and the curses for disobedience. What it dawned on me in looking at that and thinking about that idea, that whole conversation, well, you're just doing it to be saved. And he's like, no, I'm not doing it for that reason. I'm doing it for this. That whole conversation is framed around us. You and me and them that disagree. How we benefit from that. Y'all remember that phrase that was popular some time ago, is where it says, it's not about you? Yeah, we need to learn that one again. That needs to make a comeback, because he has concern for his holy name. When this stuff is going on in Ezekiel, it's his concern for his holy name. So we won't go on blaspheming and looking bad and all of that for our own sake. It's that we're blaspheming his name among the nations through our disobedience through the Torah. So obedience to the Torah as a believer in Messiah is less about you and your salvation. It's about him. He goes on, he says, therefore say to the house of Israel, thus says Adonai Elohim, I do not do this for your sake. It's not about you, house of Israel, but for my holy name which you have profaned among the nations wherever you went. I will sanctify my great name which has been profaned among the nations, which you have profaned among them. Guys, we're still profaning his name far too often. He says, the nations will know that I am Adonai. It is a declaration of Adonai when I am sanctified in you before their eyes. And how is that going to happen? Adonai will be sanctified in you and me, in his people, in his covenant people. He will be sanctified in us before the eyes of the nations. So understand, that obedience to the Torah as a believer in Messiah is less about you and your salvation, less about blessings and curses, but it's about his name. And when we say or accept the argument that, Jewish believers in Yeshua have an obligation to the Torah, but Gentile believers don't. Y'all have heard that one before, right? When we accept that argument, what we're saying is that Gentile believers, because we are from or we're of the nations, that we have permission to continue profaning his name among the nations. Anybody want to take that permission? These guys over here, they're supposed to stop profaning his name among the nations, but you keep doing it if you want to. Don't sign me up for this. Anybody want to sign up for this? You have permission to profane his name. In Paul's day, if the Jewish rabbis and the leaders, whether believers in Yeshua or not, if they wanted to maintain a distance or some kind of positional difference by not encouraging Torah for the Gentiles, by making it hard for them to hear or to approach the Torah, you're teaching them that you want them, or that it's okay for them to go on blaspheming his name. Rather than trying to change that you would have nobody blaspheming his name. Isn't that the goal? Let's get to the place where nobody blasphemes his name. That's a good goal. How do we get there? Paul is saying that if you're willing to accept that premise, then you don't really care about his name, and you only care about yourself and your own name. You're making a name for yourself just like they did at Babel. You're wanting to replace God's name with your own. If you don't accept that calling to share the Torah with the nations. And so who is really profaning it among the nations? The ignorant ones who don't know the Torah are not the ones that are profaning his name among the nations. It's the ones who do know the Torah that are profaning his name. Those with the covenants and the promise, whether believers or unbelievers in Yeshua, who look down on all these Gentiles, they must not rest comfortably with their status, thinking that all is good, that I'm okay, I've got nothing to worry about, I've got nothing to change. And that's the premise. That's where Paul is starting from in all of this, where he is saying these types of things, that you are profaning his name among the nations. Consider the sign of the covenant made with Abraham back in Genesis 17. It's that sign of circumcision. Paul goes right to it. He says, circumcision is indeed worthwhile if you keep the Torah. But if you break the Torah, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. Remember, he is a legal scholar. This is not saying anything about God or his nature or whether he's going to keep his promise or not, because he is. He is always going to keep his promise in the covenant. But the sign that you have accepted the terms, the sign that you have accepted the covenant, the circumcision, When you break it, it's as if you're starting over. And has Paul already established that they have broken the covenant? Yeah, he's already been laying that foundation. It is of no value when the Torah is broken. Just having the sign is not good enough. Think of this week's Torah portion with Dinah. Right? What happened to her in this week's Torah portion? Dinah, for those who preferred a good old American pronunciation. What happened to her? She was assaulted and raped, right? Remember that? And the man who did it came and said, "Hey, I really like her. I want to do right and marry her." Right? You don't remember that? She was raped by this uncircumcised Gentile, but the condition that they put on them for marriage was that those uncircumcised men of Shechem become circumcised. Y'all remember that? And after that was agreed to, after that was done, on the third day, after blood was spilled, on the third day, instead of redemption, instead of reconciliation, which is what the process is supposed to go, the picture it's supposed to be, Jacob's sons, Simeon and Levi, spilled more blood and brought vengeance. And in that moment, those who had been circumcised acted more like the uncircumcised. And even Jacob called them out on it. He says, "You brought trouble on me, making me a stench among the inhabitants of the land, among the Canaanites and the Perizzites. You have profaned my name among the nations." They had not only blasphemed Jacob's name, how were they any better than the Gentiles? It had become as if they were no different or no better. They didn't stand apart. They weren't any better. It's as if the sign of the covenant is undone and irrelevant for them because they've broken the covenant. And if that's the case for the circumcised while they break the covenant, how much more impact will keeping it have on those who are uncircumcised? This is the point he's making. So, circumcision is indeed worthwhile if you keep the Torah, but if you break the Torah, your uncircumcision has become uncircumcision. There's more. If the uncircumcised keeps the righteous decrees of the Torah, this is how much more will not his uncircumcision be counted as circumcision? Well, if not keeping the terms of the covenant, and in this context, that's talking about two primary things. Rejecting the goal of the Torah, which is Messiah Yeshua, and secondly, the people rejecting their calling to the Gentiles. Right? If you're not keeping the terms of the covenant, that renders the circumcised as if they were uncircumcised. Then the keeping the terms of the covenant, and again, that means accepting the goal of the Torah, which is Messiah, and that calling to learn, to keep, and share the Torah, even among the Gentiles, that renders the uncircumcised as if they were, whether the act actually happens or not. And so the Gentiles are elevated into the covenants of promise by the pronouncement, by the acceptance of King Messiah. They are made citizens of the Commonwealth of Israel. They are adopted into the family. They are given an inheritance. And we looked at the evidence for how that's true last week, about how by faith in Yeshua, that Gentile Cornelius and his household, his family, received the same Ruach HaKodesh, the same Holy Spirit as the Jewish believers did in Acts chapter 2 in fulfillment of the prophet Joel. But that elevation of the uncircumcised who fulfill the Torah by faith in Messiah, they're elevated to a place that's even higher than those who are circumcised but don't. He says in verse 27, "Indeed, the one not circumcised physically who fulfills the Torah will judge you, who even with the written code and circumcision break the Torah." See, most Jewish theology understands that they will be judging the nations, and it's not going to be the other way around. And I would largely agree. Israel is supposed to be the nation that sets the standard for all other nations. But the question is, who is Israel? And who are the covenant people by which the roles are assigned? This one reverses the expectation that the uncircumcised people will judge those who have the Torah and are uncircumcised because they've broken it. Who have the Torah but hear it and don't do it. Who break it because they may have the Torah but they fail to recognize Messiah. That's the most important part of it. The outward and the physical appearance does not make someone, even a Jewish person, any more right in the eyes of God than a man putting on a dress will make them a woman, which is something we deal with, right? Wearing the long tzitzits and fine robes does not make someone Jewish in the eyes of God or a covenant keeper in the eyes of God. Making a show of giving tzedakah at the temple doesn't do that, right? He says, for one is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is circumcision something visible in the flesh. So it's being Jewish is not the most important factor. Being someone in covenant with the Father is what matters. A matter of faith, of belief, of the heart, just like Abraham, who believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. Just like Isaac, he had two sons, one who believed and one who was godless. It says in verse 29, rather, the Jew is one inwardly, and circumcision is of the heart, in spirit, not in letter. And his praise is not from men, but from God. The internal heart, isn't that where the Torah is always supposed to be? Wasn't that always the goal, in your heart? Isn't that the new covenant from Jeremiah that we read just a little while ago? Doesn't that promise to make that happen for those who are in covenant with him, those who believe? In Paul's day, when Romans was written, this synagogue was struggling because they looked at the outward appearance more than anything else. They looked at the family lineage more than the heart of faith. And Paul knew that only by recognizing the faith of these Gentiles could the Jewish believers rightly guide them, rightly teach them, and show them the light. Only then would they remain together as one people and be strong. So he is encouraging them not to fall into the same old traps that entrench that superiority over calling, rich over poor, Jew over Gentile. Instead, he wants this congregation to see the Gentiles in the same way that Yeshua described two men going to pray at the temple. Remember this in Luke chapter 18. Yeshua spoke this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous while holding others in contempt. And these are going to be two Jewish people that he's sharing this account about. Both men are Jewish entering the temple, but class and money and other things elevates one over the other. But understand, this could easily be speaking of the Pharisee who is leading the synagogue in a place like Rome, and those Gentiles who are genuinely coming to learn Torah and to seek the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He says, two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. Think about it in that sense of the two men going up to pray in the temple, one a Pharisee leading the synagogue in Rome, and the other being this Gentile. The Pharisee stood and was praying to himself, "O God, I thank you that I am not like the other people, thieving, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector, even like this Gentile." He says, I fast twice a week. I tithe on all that I get, all these things that are visible and exterior that other people can see and shower their praises on me for. But the tax collector, and you could put in there the idea of the Gentile, standing some distance away, those who are far away, wouldn't even lift his eyes toward heaven, but beat his chest, saying, God, be merciful to me, the sinner. And Yeshua says, I tell you, this man, rather than the other, went down to his home declared righteous. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. This is status before God, not based on the exterior, not based on outward appearances, but based on faith and what he sees in us. This is the Spirit, not the letter, because his praise, his approval is from men, it's not from God. The one that says he went away declared righteous, nobody looking at that situation would think so. Everybody watching from the outside would go away thinking, boy, that other guy, he's the one that is right with God. All those who believe in Yeshua as Messiah should be welcomed so that God's name is not blasphemed, should be welcomed so that the Torah would go forth from Zion, should be welcomed to keep all of these things because they're called to the king's law. And the Jew and Gentile are called to keep it together as one people and not worry so much about what other people think about it, their criticisms or their rejection. All of his disciples are supposed to be taught everything he is commanding. And so together, when we come together to do that and live that way, then we can guide and lead and teach and shine the light for everybody else, whether Jew or Gentile, who are still blind, we can be the light for those that are still in darkness. We can still correct the foolish, the teachers of the immature. Even for those who have the Torah, but don't yet embrace its goal. Because Messiah is the goal of the Torah, as a means to establishing that righteousness for everyone who keeps trusting by faith. And we are all invited to keep his commands. And if he is our king, we will do it, won't we?